Welcome to the integration phase. In here, we're going to get this started by getting some starter files that we need for the rest of this project. We are also going to create a folder structure for our API base. So the first thing we are going to do is put in some files. So the first thing we're going to do, open the folder that you got from me. You'll see the starter project in case you skipped the design portion or you want a fresh one. I have the starter project in there. And then the other thing is I have the starter file. So when you open the starter files for this, you're going to see two folders, one that says assets, one that says previews. And I set them up a little differently than I did the first video. In this one, I'm giving you the actual image assets or image sets instead. And instead of doing it the other way that I normally do, which is you have to do it and then make all your single and all that stuff. This is a little bit quicker and it gets you going pretty fast. So we have a preview. We're going to start with that. So here we have preview content and then preview. And right now we only have Ultra Watch in there. We have featured products and we have Ultra Watch here. So let's go ahead and just delete the Ultra Watch that's in there because it'll just recreate it again. We're going to drag all three of these folders, Command Shift click all of them. We're going to just drag them right in just as folders, and they are now in this project. So I gave you way more assets than you actually probably need. You have some extras so you can play around with different bands, different things. So they're all in there. Feel free, have at it, have fun. Okay, so now that we have the assets, let's create our folder structure. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to clear this out. I'm going to close this folder. I'm going to click on the main folder. And in the main folder, I'm going to, on Apple Watch Store, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say new group, almost said file. And I'm going to call this networking. Boom. So now we want to add some folders to the networking file. So we're going to right click on the group. We're going to select new group and we're going to put a endpoints folder in there. Then we're going to right click again. We're going to do new group again. We're going to add models. We need two more folders, right click new group, and we're going to call it base. And finally, right click new group. We're going to call this service. We'll put services as plural, and that's good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the models up and make sure that you don't put it in the folder of another thing. So we want endpoints, models, services, and then base. I put base on the bottom since that's the one file that you won't actually, once we get it done, it'll be the least file that you enter and go into. But so I put it at the bottom. And now we have everything done that we need to set up. So we're going to create our first file, which is going to be the HTTP method. So we're going to right click on the folder and we're going to select new file. We're going to make it a Swift file and hit next. And we're going to call this HTTP method. In this HTTP method, we're going to work on getting the methods that happen when we're fetching. So we can use different methods like get, put, post. All of those we want to put into a file so that when we go to make request, once we create the base, we'll have all of the different types of methods we need. So we don't have to come back into the base and make any changes, but you still may have to make some changes, but at least we'll get most of it in. So the first thing we want to do is just create an enum, and we're going to call it a request method, and it's going to be set to a string. Then inside of here, we're going to add a delete case first, and then we'll add a get. Then next we'll add a patch, a post, and a put. And that's all we're going to need for this request method. So now that we have that, we can now go ahead and create another file. So we're going to open up the Project Navigator again, right click on base and select new file. And in this file, we're going to call this one, we're going to select Swift file. We're going to hit next, and we're going to call this endpoint and hit return. Now that we have our endpoint set up, this file here is going to set up our URL paths and the HTTP method for each API request. This is also where we're going to kind of set up our base URL. So this will probably be the only file that you'll need to change when you move it from project to project. If you keep using Macoun first, then you won't really need to change this, or you can even create another extension where you can have flexibility on like a staging server versus a production server, or however you want to do it. You have pretty much free reign over this, but I think the overall setup you'll understand when we get there. So let's first create our protocol endpoint. And then inside of this protocol endpoint, we're going to create a couple of variables that we're going to need. So we're first going to need a schema. We're then going to have a host. After we create the host, we're going to create a path. Then we need a method. And then a header, a body, and port. And port's important in particular when it comes to using Macoun. You don't normally need ports otherwise. At least I haven't really used it any other way other than for Macoun. So you don't have to it's a protocol, but you don't have to use it. All right. So now that we have our protocol set up, every service that we create is going to have an endpoint, and it's going to be based off of this protocol. So what we want to do is create an extension that every service that gets created will work from. So let's create the extension next. And then inside of here, we're going to set up just 3 different base variables that we need for every endpoint that we're going to use in this particular case for the course. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to update schema. We're going to create a string, and we're going to set it to HTTP. So that's our endpoint there. Then we're going to create the host. And in this case, it's going to match whatever you have in Macoun. So earlier when we looked at it, ours was 127.0.0.1. Now you'll notice, okay, so let's get that out of the way. So let's create our host, and let's do a 127.0.0.1 is our host. And then finally, we just need to create our port. And this is the key. So if you have multiple items within Macoun, it may change the port. So just verify that if you have trouble getting a connection, but you verified that it worked in the browser, just check your port. And so let's add our port. And then in our port, we're going to return 3000. Now keep in mind, this number can change depending on what port number you're using inside of Macoun. So now that we have our endpoint, the next thing we want to do is create our request errors. So this will be the file that we use in case we get an error and we want to make sure that we get the right stuff coming back to give us a better way of debugging. So we're going to do a new file again under the base, select Swift file, hit next, and then we're going to call this request error and hit return. In the request error, we can go ahead and close the panel. Now that we have a request error created, this is the file that, again, we are going to use to make sure that if we have any problems, we know about it. And I'll put this file into the starter project so that I'll put this file in the files for this particular video so that you have the text and you can just copy and paste these text instead of having to type everything. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create an enum for the request error, and we're going to set that enum to a string and an error. And you're going to get some errors because we need to fill in a couple of things. So the first thing we're going to do is add a case statement. And the first case statement is going to be decode. Then we need to get an invalid URL as our other case statement. And we need 3 more. So we're going to add a case statement for invalid response. We're going to add a case statement for decodable. And we're going to add a case statement for unknown. Now, again, this is another file that can adjust based on the things that you do for your projects. So just because this is what I'm using doesn't mean that you can expand on this if you have other areas that you're getting errors and you want to make sure that you cover them. So I would highly recommend that, as you grow and as you expand, you can expand on this. And some of you may already have things that you've done in the past that you can just throw in here and use. And then finally, we want to create a description for each one of the case statements that come through. So let's create a variable for our description and set it to a string. And then inside of the description, we're going to create a switch statement. And then we need to make sure that we cover each different property or each different case. Make sure that we cover each different case. So the first one we want to do is the decode case. And we're going to return a data parsing error if something comes back wrong on there. Then we're going to add a invalid URL, and this will be if the URL is not found. Then we will do a decodable, and for those that may be new to iOS, decodable is where we decode. We basically map our model objects to JSON, and sometimes if you do the wrong name or you do something that's messed up, this will let us know that we didn't decode we didn't decode it correctly. So that's there for decodable. The next one is invalid response. And then the final one is if we get something that we're not sure about or we didn't have a case for it, we'll get back an server unreachable unknown. And that can, again, you can change all of this and modify this how you feel. We shouldn't have any problems with our base, but at least you have it set up. And down the road, if you do, this is kind of where you would fix it for your base. So we have our request error file finished. Now we just have one more file that we need to create for our base, and our base is done. And that's the HTTP client. So we're going to right click on the base. We're going to do new file. We're going to select Swift file. We're going to hit next. And we're going to do HTTP client. Now, there's a lot of typing in this one. So the first thing we want to do is create a protocol for the client. So we're going to create an HTTP protocol. And then inside of here, we're going to create a function called request. And this is how we're going to basically create we're going to call this method every time we want to make a request from any of our services. So we're going to say request, and here we're going to use decodable. And you're using some generics that we're going to be able to pass any object to that we create. So when we create our models, we'll be able to just pass the model that we're going to need to get decoded, and then it will give us back the object we want. So this is where our request is going to be. Very high level on that generics explanation, but basically just know that it's the simplest way that I can explain it is we are making it so we can use any data model that we create. Now, there's probably some outliers and some exceptions, but overall, that's what the t.type means. Okay, and the t at the beginning of a request is here. So next thing we want to do is create an extension that will now make the calls that we need for this HTTP client. I keep stuttering on that. Okay, so let's create our extension. And then we want to create the function that we just had in the protocol. So we're going to call the request. And so this request is basically the same thing that we basically put in our protocol. So the protocol is basically saying, hey, you need to make, if you're going to use HTTP, see, I'm still saying that and stuttering. If we use the HTTP client, we have to use the request. So Now let's go ahead and get into the nitty gritty of this. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a URL component. And what this will do is it takes a URL and it breaks it down into small parts from our endpoint. So the endpoint file will give it the URL we need, the schema, the path, and the port, and we'll do all of that. So what first thing we want to do is we want to grab the schema and we're going to take it from the endpoint. So that's why we're passing in the endpoint. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the path and we're going to get it from the endpoint. And then finally, we're going to get the port from the endpoint and set it to the URL scheme. Then we're going to check we're going to check the components to make sure that a URL has been given to us, because if it doesn't, then we're just going to send a failure back and say, hey, invalid URL, because we didn't actually give it a URL. So next thing we're going to do is create a guard. And then in this guard, we're going to say, we're going to use the let URL. And if the component doesn't have a URL, we are then going to return a failure. Now, the guard is basically exactly that. Think of it like a club. The guard is there. It's going to basically check to make sure you have your URL or your valid ID. If you're good, you're going to be able to get past the guard. If you're not, it's going to send you away. So here, a guard is we're using a guard to make sure that we don't have to worry about any other issues. We can stop something that happens before it happens. Okay, now that we have our guard, we want to create a request. So we're going to now pass the URL that we verified into the URL request. So here we're going to create a URL request. And so this URL request will now do the work that we need to do. So we have to do a do catch to make this work. So we're going to work on the do first. So our do. And now we're now going to create a response. So we're going to take the request and we're going to pass it into a URL session. And we're going to use the try and await that we discussed earlier. From here, we should get back data and a response, two different objects that come back. So the first thing is we want to check the response. And here we're going to add another guard. So now we're in the VIP session of the club. You got through to the club because you had the right ID, but now if you don't have the right, if the response comes back or something comes back wrong, we're going to basically block you from going anywhere past that. So next thing we're going to do is add our guard for the response. And if the response comes back in a invalid response, then we're going to basically say you can't come in. So here we're going to add our failure. Now that we've got our response, we can then say, okay, we have a response that's coming back, and let's check different types of responses. And this is where the Makun really works, because you can go in and customize the response. Right now it's set to 200, which means good. So anywhere from 200 to 299 means that we have a good response. And then we have some other outliers. So you could do some testing where, okay, I get a 400 error, I get this kind of error, and then you can test to make sure your app responds the way it should. So the first thing we want to do is add a switch statement. And then in this switch statement, we're going to add the status code that we're looking for. So the first thing we want to do is check for the case of being 200 range to 299. So now we have our case for the 200 to 299. Now we know that if we get a response with those status codes, we should have good data, but we still want to check. So the next thing we're going to do is add another guard. So this is like VIP. Now we have our guard, and our guard is going to check with the JSON, and it's going to decode it. If something happens with the decode process, we want to make sure that we return a failure so we know. So in here, we'll add our else. And if something happens, we're going to return a failure. Next, after we do this, we're then going to say, okay, everything is good. We can then pass it. But we want to return the success. So let's add a return for the success part of this. So now we know that the case 200, between 200 and 299, we know if we get a response that's decodable wrong, if the decoding process is wrong, we'll get a failure. If it's correct, we'll return the success back to us, and we'll then be able to use the data that comes back. So then that's there. So we still need to cover a couple of other instances. So let's cover 401. So we're going to do a case for 401. And if that comes back as a failure, which we get a 401, then that usually is a failure. So we're going to then return a failure and say it was an invalid response. We want to also just default if we get any other kinds of weird case statement, any kind of weird status codes outside of the 200 range, we also want to just cover that. So we're just going to give a generic response and say failure, invalid response. So now we've covered anything that successfully comes through good. We then make sure that the JSON is decoded correctly. If it is, we return the JSON, we return the response from the JSON. If it doesn't, we say that there's failure and there's something wrong with our codable model. Next, we go and do the 401 and then the default. So we check 401, we check default, and here's where I mean that you can come here and tweak it. If you have more case statements that you want to check, you can add them by all means. Okay, now that we have this, we just need to do a catch. So right now we're doing a do. And our do is basically going to try and make sure that this happens. But if something happens with anywhere within here that acts funny, we want to catch it. So we're going to add a catch. And then inside of the catch, we just want to say invalid URL for a failure. And so let's add that. And now we have our entire HTTP client request created, and we can clean this up a bit. I like things that are short. If there are things that we can read, I like to put them on one line. Here we're good. I'm going to clean up this extra space, and I think everything is good there. Let's scroll. Yeah, I think that's pretty clean. Get rid of that line at the bottom. All right. So our HTTP client is done. Our base is done. And now what we want to do is create the two services we're going to need to actually fetch our data. So make sure that Makun is running so that when you go to build the project, you're not, why isn't mine running and yours is? Okay, so make sure, I'm going to probably mention this again, but just make sure that your client is running now in the background wherever you are coding, because mine won't help you. All right, so let's open up this. We're going to close the base. And the first thing we want to do is we want to get our products in. So we're going to right click on the endpoints and we're going to say new file, Swift file, and hit next. And we're going to call this products endpoint and hit return. And this file go ahead and close the panel. Okay, now with our products endpoint done, what we want to do is we want to basically, this is where the base that we just created and all of this magic happens. So now we don't have to mess with base. All we need to do is for every endpoint or every call that we want to make, depending on your endpoint. So I shouldn't say every endpoint, but depending on every call you want to make, you're going to do these steps over and over again. And we're going to do it twice. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create an endpoints file. That's step one. Step two is we're going to create a data object that we're going to use for when the JSON comes back, we map it to that. And then the last thing we want to do is we need a service, and the service is what's going to make our call and our request. And then it'll all get wrapped into those three files. And that'll be pretty much the way that you'll create. So if you take this project and you take the networking file and you move it over to the next file, you'll make a little bit of your tweaks to match what you need. And then from there, all you have to do is just create the same three files over and over again, depending on what you're doing. Name the files, obviously, what you're fetching for, what your endpoints are. So it just makes sense when you go back to your project. So Let's create an enum. And here we're going to say products endpoint. And then inside of here, we're going to create a case statement. And this can be anything you want. Right now, because I'm only using it for fetching all of the products, I'm going to just create a case for all. Now, in this case, let's say different scenarios of what you could do for cases. Let's say you want to get a product ID for fetching just one singular product. So here you could do a case with a product and an ID that you just pass an integer or a string, and that will come back. So this is where your endpoints, if you have various ones, you can then pass those in. So that's what's very helpful about this. Now let's create our extension. And our extension is going to extend off endpoint. And here we can make the changes or the things that we want to add on to when it fetches what we can make the changes that we want to do. Or let me rephrase. Here is where we're able to add the extra things that we need for products specifically. So we're going to create a method for the path. And in this case, we want to fetch it off of the products path. So we're going to add a path for the string. And then we're going to add a switch statement. In this case, we're not really switching on much because we only have one. So we're just going to say case all, and we're going to return products. Now, that's pretty much all we have to do for that. So we're appending products to the endpoint, and our base will add that when it does its request when we call it. So now we need a method, and the method is going to be what type of fetching we're going to do or what type of request we need. In this case, and in pretty much the entire this entire course, we're just doing gets. So here we're going to do a method, and we're going to say that for the switch for all, we want to pass in .get. So that's perfect. Now we have two more things. So header could technically be in the base, and it could be in this one. It doesn't matter. I think if we repeat it, which we probably will, we could refactor header and move it over. But in some cases, you may need something specific for header that you may need to pass. Let's say an API key or something like that. Then you probably want to put it into the base, or you put it into endpoint. It's really up to you and your preference. But I would just say whatever you do, just keep it consistent, just so that you know where it is. And you don't put it in one endpoint and then you put it in the base in another, and then you're all confused. So we have our method. Now let's do our header. So we're going to create a header, and we will do a switch on all of the different case statements. So we're going to do a switch, and then we're going to add an all. And then here we're just going to add a dictionary, and we're going to set a content type, which will be set to JSON. So again, this particular header, this is pretty going to be common in the next file we create. And I'm going to leave it here, but on your project, you could just take this header and move it to your base. And then if you need something specific for header, you can then add the header, and you don't have to add it twice. But for now, we'll just leave it here. And then finally, we just need to do the body, which I don't believe we have to do anything specifically for it. We don't really need anything, but we're going to create a body. We're going to switch on this body, and we're just going to return nil. Okay, so we've got our extensions. We've got our products endpoint created. Now, remember I said we have to create a products endpoint. We have to create a data object for that. And then finally, we have to create the service that fetches. All of that's gone. All right, so now we need to create our data. And in particular, the way that the data works is, for products, we have some objects that are contained, or array of items that are contained inside of each product. So we want to create those first before we create the actual product model. So we're going to open up the project navigator. We're going to right click, and we're going to do new file. And we're going to do Swift data and hit next. And we're going to do, for this one, wrist size data and hit return. And we can close. Now that we have our risk data file created, let's go ahead and add this. So we only have a few things that we need for risk data. And in particular, we need size, we need description, and we need order. And the order just gives us how we want it to be displayed. So let's first create our class. And it's going to be set to an identifiable encodable. I'm going to go ahead and now create an ID first. And I'm going to set it to UUID string. Now, if you're working with a normal server, you could set the ID to whatever's in the feed. The only reason why I do it this way is because sometimes when you're doing stuff in Macoun, if you mess up on your IDs, it will then break, and then you have to try to hunt around for which of the items has the same. So whenever I'm dealing with Macoun, I always just make it give me a unique ID, so I don't have to worry about creating it in my JSON. Even though I do have ID in there, it's just a safe way to do it. So that's that. Next thing we want to do is create a size, and we're going to set it to a string, an empty string. We're going to create a description and set that to an empty string. And then finally, we're going to create order, and we're going to set that to an integer, and we'll set the integer to 0. Nice. So we want to create an init method for this custom. So we're just going to do an init method that will take an ID, a size, and a description and an order. And then we just need to set each property. So we're going to say self.id equals ID, size equals size, description equals description, and order equals order. Perfect. Now, whenever I do SwiftUI, and you're using Swift previews, especially in the case of when the data is being brought in, when you're dealing with previews, you want to have data done. And I don't like to have to write the data each time I need it. So what I do is I create a default variable that I can use whenever I need to pass that model object to it. So we're just going to create a static variable called default. And inside of here, we're just going to create a risk data, size data object. And we're just going to put in the default values we want. And you can make these anything you want. I have S/M, and then I have band fits 130 to 180 millimeter wrists. And then I have order as 1. And you can put any data you want, but this is basically for Swift previews, and that's it. You can put it in extension, or you can leave it in here as inside of the class. Depends on what you want to do. Okay, now we need to create another file called case size data. So we're going to go right click on the models, hit new file, select Swift file, and hit next. And we're going to say case size data and hit return. We can close. Now that we have our case size data created, let's go ahead. We're just going to do the same thing. In this one, we're going to need 5 properties, not including ID. So we have size, we have description, we have price, we have amount, and we have order. So let's create those. So the first thing we're going to do is create our class and set it to identifiable encodable again. We're then going to create the ID. Then we need size, and we're going to set it to a string and make it empty, an empty string, sorry. Then we're going to create a description and set it to an empty string. We will set a price, and we're going to set it to a string. And we're going to do float. We're going to do amount, and we're going to set it to a float, and we'll set the float to 0.0. Finally, we'll do order. Again, we'll set it to an integer. It'll be an integer and set to 0. Good. Now we just need to create our init method. We'll pass in the ID, the size, the description, the price, the amount, and the order. And then we'll set each of the different values. So the first thing we'll do is set ID to ID, size to size, description to description, price to price, amount to amount, and finally order to order. And it's good to put the self in front. I didn't mention this in the last one, but you want to put self in there because self refers to the class, and then the other one refers to the parameter being passed through in it. Let's create an extension that we can add. Instead, before we put the default value for our previews in the class. This time we'll put it in the extension so you can see both ways. So we're going to create an extension first for case size data. Then we're going to create a static variable, just like we did before, called default. And we're going to set it to case size data. And then in here, we're just going to create a case size data with, we're going to do size set to 45 millimeters. We're going to set the description to fits 140 to 220 millimeters. We'll set the price to $279. We'll set the amount to 279.0. So we're adding both because that's the way the feed's going to be set up. And then we're adding the order as one, and that's what we will have in the feed. So now case size is done. And we can finally get to the product data, and the product data is massive. There's a lot going on. So we are going to do a lot of typing in this next one. So let's go back. We're going to open up the models. We're going to right click and we're going to say new file. We're going to call this, we're going to use the Swift file, hit next, and we're going to call it product data and hit return. Let's close the panel. Now that we have our product data file created, let's get into, this is the longest file that we're going to have to write probably in this entire course. So be prepared. You might have to pause a few times just to get all of it in, but we're going to create our product data object as a class first. And next we want to do same thing as we did before. We're going to create a bunch of different ones. I'm just going to go through it instead of trying to name it off before. So the first thing we want to do is have an ID, set it to a string. We're going to set a is featured. And this is going to be useful for when we want to flag a particular item in the JSON for featuring it on the homepage. So this is what this is featured is for. And we're set it to a Boolean. We're then going to create a band display. Then we're going to set that to a string. We're going to do a band type and make it a string. We're going to set series. We're going to create a series and set it to a string. We're then going to say series display and set it to a string. We now need the material display and set it to a string. We want a material type and set it to a string. We're going to create a finish display, set it to a string. Pretty much every one of these are pretty much strings. We're then going to do a finish type, set to a string. Band color type, string. Band color display is a string. Collection is a string. Collection type is a string. We are then going to do a image as a string. Description, we're going to use DECS, shorthand for description for a string. We're then going to we need an array of case sizes. So we're going to do let case sizes set to case size data. We're then going to do wrist sizes and set that to an array of wrist size data. And finally, we're going to create a variable called isFavorite, and we're going to set that to false. So the isFavorite is going to be used in Swift data. We're just going to create the variable. It's going to get passed to the next object that we will create for Swift data, but by default, we're going to set everything false in the API, and then we'll use Swift data to basically trigger it off and on. Okay, now we need to make our coding keys. So we're going to map everything specifically to this. So let's go ahead and create an extension. So the first thing we're going to do inside of our extension is create a static variable. We're going to set it to default, same way as before. And we're going to set it to product data. And now we're going to create a product data that we can use. So the first thing we need to do is create the product data. And then inside of the product data, we want to be able to add each of the different things. I'm going to just set an ID, and you can put it to anything. You can just set it to 1. You can then set the is featured, so false. We're going to create a band display. Again, all of this can be however you want. If you want to put in the real data, you can. If you just want to put in fake data, you can. I try to keep it as close to the design as possible so that I don't have to go in and add things. So I try to do it that way. But again, you don't have to. We're going to do the type, and we'll set it to sports loop. We'll do the series. We'll say SE. We'll set the series display. We'll set the material display to aluminum. We'll set the material type to aluminum. We'll set the finish display to silver. Finish type silver. And all of these will pertain to filtering. So that's why it's very specific in this case. But again, it's not really for some of this data isn't really being used in the display. So it's not necessary for the preview. But because we have the data, we need to give it everything. So some of these things you don't have to technically put in, but I do it for all. Next thing we'll do is band color type. And then band color display. Then collection type. Image. And that's actually not even being used anymore because I redid some things. So image isn't there. So you can get rid of image. But for now, we'll just keep it. We'll do description. And then we're going to create case sizes. And here's where we do a little bit of a shortcut. So in case sizes, you could make a case size and then if you want to set like multiple array of items for the data. For here, I don't really need multiple items. One is fine for my case because we already kind of have it working in multiple versions in our prototype. So we don't need to do that. But in this case, we can just do case size data and we can set it to the default and then that array. And then we'll do the same thing with wrist sizes and we'll set the wrist size data to the default. And now we don't have to rewrite that data again. So it makes it really easy, and we'll be able to do the same thing when we work with our Swift data. We'll be able to pass this default to it as well, and that'll fill in all of our data for it. So we just have to do it once, and then we can reuse it. And we're done with the product data. So now all we have to do is create our service, and then we have to do this one more time for the filtering of the data. So let's open the panel. We're going to right click on the services. And we're going to say new file. Select Swift file. And hit next. And we're going to call this product service. And hit return. Close this panel. Okay. And I named the product service wrong, so I'm going to go in and fix that. So I'm going to just rename this as an R and hit return. And let's close. Okay, so let's go ahead and first add our protocol. And inside of here in the product serviceable, we're going to create a fetch and we're going to call it fetch products. So we have our fetch products and we're going to want to get back an array of data. So that's there. And we're going to get a request error if something happens when we do the fetch. The next thing we'll do is we'll create a struct, and that will be a struct that will conform to the HTTP client and the product serviceable that we just created. So let's do that. So we have our struct. It conforms to the It conforms to the product serviceable and the HTTP client. And let's see, did I mess up on that? Okay, now let's go ahead and right now it's complaining that we're not conforming. So let's create the fetch. And now we are, so that error should go away. And now we just need to return back what it wants. And this is pretty simple. It's just one line. We're going to do a return. And we're going to set up the request. We're going to pass in the endpoint that we're looking for. And then inside of here, we're going to say, this is the model that we want. So when we're requesting data that comes back as an array, we're going to do bracket and then the data. If we were going to get a object back, we would just get rid of the brackets and do product data. But because we're expecting a return of an array, we can't do that. So that's why right now, when me changing this is breaking it, because it's saying I need back an array, not an object. So I'll add those back and our product service is done. Here's the challenge for you. Now that I've done this, I don't think I need to go back through it again for the filter one. So I'll give you the opportunity to pause the video right now and to see if you can set up the product filtering section. And when you come back after the pause, I will go through each thing that I did so we're all on the same page. So you have a chance to go in and see if you can figure out how you do it yourself. And I think that's a pretty good challenge. And then we'll get back to where I am once you come back. All right. Now that you've taken the time to see if you can meet the challenge, I'm going to go over what I did and you can compare. Now the naming will probably be different. You might have the same name or not. The naming doesn't matter as long as you know what you named it when you call the methods or when you call everything. So I have a product filter endpoint that's set to all as my case. We are fetching. This is important. So product filters, because that's what's in the actual Strappy. If you want to modify that and make it different, you can, but that's what's in Strappy in the file that I gave you. The rest of this is just like we did in the products. So it should be the same. We're setting a get, we're setting the header to be the same, and we're setting the body to return nil. So there we go. All right, now it's time to look at the next file, which is going to be product filter data. And in here, you are going to need an ID, a category order, title, type, and is selected. Our coding keys are set up, and the only one that you have to specify is category order. And then we have our init method that creates the object. Next file we want to look at is the product filter service. So let's do that. Product filter service. And here I created a fetch product filters. I'm going to return back my product filter data, or in this case, you're going to return the data object you created in the name. And then I created the struct that conforms to the HTTP client and the product filter serviceable, which is what I named it. Again, this will be probably slightly different if whatever you named yours. And then I have this fetch product filters that returns an array of product filter data and a request error. And then I just call the request and I set the endpoint to all. And finally, I set the response model to the product filter data and set it as an array. Now we just need to create our data manager, and we have to do one other thing after that, but we are pretty much there and we can start seeing some data in the console. So let's start by creating a data. Let's start by creating a data manager. We're going to go into the navigator. We're going to right click on the networking folder and we're going to say new file. Then we're going to create a Swift file and hit next. And we're going to call this data manager. Okay, we can now close the panel down and we are going to create our data manager class. So the first thing that we need to do is start with our observable. And this is going to be used to observe any changes to this file that we need to do throughout the project. And we're going to now create a class manager, and we're going to set it to final. Inside of here, we have a few properties that we need to make. So the first thing we're going to do is create a reference to our product service. And then we're going to create a reference to our filter service. Next, we're going to create an array of product data that we can keep track of. We are also going to keep track of the filter data. And now that that's good, we want to initialize our data. And you can see here is where I'm doing the async. So this is the first part of what the async await does. Here, it's the async function, and then we can do a try when we call it, you'll see how it all connects. But this is the first part of the async. And then inside of here, we just want to initialize some of our data. So we're going to first create a do. And then inside of our do, we're going to fetch our products. So here's our await. And the fetch products is erroring because we haven't created this function yet. We're going to create one in the data manager. We need to do the same thing with filter data. So we're going to create a filter data, and we're going to set it to fetch product filter. And that should be filters. And we will then we're going to dump the data that comes back so that we can see it in the console. And let's also dump the filter data at the same time. And now the reason why we're using dump versus print is dump gives us a lot more information than if you just use print. Print will just say you have 12 items of product data in an array or 30 products of product filter data in an array, whereas dump will actually show you each of the different properties inside of the array, and that all of the sub properties inside of that have data. So it's a better way to kind of just make sure all your data got through. All right, now we need a catch. And so inside of this catch, we're going to debug. If something happens, we will just print out something here. And if you get to this is probably because your Macoon isn't connected. Next, we will create our fetch products function. And in here, we will do an async throws, and we will return a product data, an array that's optional. So if something comes back, great. If it doesn't, it's going to be an empty array. We'll create a local variable inside of the function that's going to hold the products. We will then use our service to fetch those products. And then inside of here, we're going to switch on the results. So first thing we want to do is check for a success. And if there is a success, we're going to set the results. We're going to set products equal to results. Next, we are going to go ahead and return the products once we are done. We are then going to create a failure. And if we get that, we're going to just dump an error. So that way we can see it if something comes back wrong. We'll print it and see what the localized description is just to get a little bit more information. And we'll just return an empty array if nothing happens or when failure happens. Next, we're going to create our fetch product filter, and we are going to basically do the same setup. So we're going to do an async throws. We're going to set it to product filter data, and it's going to be an array of objects. We will then create a variable for product filters. We will then create a instance of our service and do the fetch. Next, we will create a switch statement. And the first thing we're going to do is run the success on the switch. If the success comes through, we're going to set the filters local variable to the result. And then we're going to return the filters. And then we'll create a same failure. This time we won't really dump the error, but we'll just print a local description of it. and we'll return an empty array. So our product filter is done. Let's just make a change. I want to change this to product filters plural, and then change this to product filters plural, just because that makes more sense since it is an array of objects. Okay, so our data manager is done. We don't have to do anything in here until we move forward. But for now, let's see how this works. So we're going to go into our app file. So Command-Shift-O, we're going to go specifically to the, for me, it's Apple Watch Store app. Yours might be slightly different depending on the name that you use to create your project. And now we want to add a little bit of code to make this work. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add a state variable, and we're going to set it to private. And one of the things that I always remember when I started learning more about state and variables and observation was that Paul Hudson saying in his video, all state variables are private. So that's kind of embedded in my brain. It's been there since day one. It's been a while, but I still remember it. All right, so we have our state variable as a manager, and we will then, for the content view, we're going to create a modifier. So we're going to say environment, and inside of here, we're just going to pass the manager. Now, what this will allow us to do is use the data manager throughout the app, and we only have to just set it here, and then we can use it whenever we need it. Next, we're going to add a task, and this task is basically going to run on the main thread, and when the app launches, it's going to run this. So we're going to say await, and we're going to do manager.initialize data. Okay, now that we're done, all we have to do is just run the project, and we are hopefully going to get some output in the console. So we'll see what happens when we do our play. So I'm going to hit try that again. Okay, now that we are done with the setup on the app page, we're going to run the project and see what happens. And fingers crossed that all of our data is working. And you can see down here in the console that we have 17 elements for product filter data. We then have 14 elements for product data. So everything is working as expected. If you are running into problems where yours is showing 0 elements or doesn't show the data at all, then just verify that Macoon's running, verify that you didn't mess up on any of the individual items by spelling. It's very important that your coding keys match, because if they don't, it won't work. So those are important. Let's make a couple of changes. Right here, we're doing observable. And even though the app still works, I think we should just import observation. I don't think we necessarily have to, but you can see it changed the color once I did that. So I wanted to tweak that. Let's tweak this file since it's not really coming from a JSON file. We'll just say unable to get product data from JSON. And what else did I want to change? I think we are good. I think everything is good. We have an app that has data that now all we have to do